Good afternoon. Welcome to the Ream Library. I'm Ron Jarrett, Associate Dean at the College and Professor in the Chemistry Department, and I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, a friend and former classmate of mine, Mark Murcko. Mark is speaking as part of the McFarland Center's lecture series on the practice of science in a world of competing values. The series is designed to get students and faculty thinking about the ethical challenges of doing science today, managing expectations from government and corporate funders, the role of science in a democratic society, ethical considerations of research involving animals, and other issues. Previous lectures featuring Holy Cross graduates Jim Collins on synthetic biology and Richard Murphy on biomedical research in institutional settings have been recorded and are available on the McFarland Center's website at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. In today's talk, Mark will address the quest for health, hunting for drugs in large pharmas and tiny biotechs. A pioneer in the development of new medicines, Mark is a self-described drug hunter, pharmaceutical executive, mentor, and fan of disruptive technology. Mark received his undergraduate degree from Fairfield University in chemistry and applied math. We were in the same entering class of the graduate program for chemistry at Yale University. And back then, at least, chemists didn't tend to associate with non-chemists to a large degree. And to make matters perhaps worse, organic chemists pretty much tended to themselves, and physical organic chemists were on a different floor than the synthetic organic chemists. So the groups got continually tighter circles in terms of who you had associated with. In the 1980s, Yale was a powerhouse for physical organic chemistry, and Mark and I were both attracted to that area of study. Mark went to one of the larger groups run by Professor Ken Weiberg, and I joined one of the smaller groups run by Professor Martin Saunders. Luckily, our labs happen to be right next to each other. I value his friendship from that time, and I have to say that Mark was a real lifeline for me, second only to my very supportive wife, Liz, in my sticking with the program at Yale. Our wives also became friends, and the four of us got together regularly to play board games. However, Kathy and Liz, our wives, insisted that Mark and I never be on the same team again after one game of Password, where Mark got me to say the word circular by giving me the clue dichroism. It's a chemistry thing. After earning his PhD, Mark worked as a senior scientist at Merck Sharp and Dome, where he helped to develop, for the treatment of glaucoma, the first approved drug that was prepared using structure-based drug design. With what must have been a risk at the time, that certainly paid off handsomely, he then left Merck to become one of the founding officers of the startup Vertex Pharmaceuticals, where he spent the next 2 decades as Chief Technology Officer and Chair of the Scientific Advisory Board. Mark was co-inventor of 3 marketed Vertex drugs, important medicines to treat HIV and hepatitis C, along with another half dozen or so compounds that progressed to human studies. He started various programs directed at treatments for cancer, multiple sclerosis, infectious diseases, inflammation, pain, and so on. Today, Mark operates a consultancy called Disruptive Biomedical and is Senior Vice President of Strategy at Schrödinger. He sits on a number of board of directors and scientific advisory boards, including Ensemble Discovery, Nimbus Discovery, Vivana, and Cuvium. He has more than 40 issued patents, 85 scientific publications, and 130 invited lectures. He has served on a number of editorial boards for publications such as the Journal of Medical Chemistry, Disruptive Science and Technology, and Drug Discovery Today. He's a visiting professor at Northeastern University and MIT and chaired the 2013 Gordon Conference on Medicinal Chemistry. Please join me in welcoming Mark.
Ron, thanks very much. It's much too kind of an introduction. I think what you'll all realize very quickly is that a resume often is misleading. But I'm pleased to be here to have the chance to give you all my perspective on what drug discovery is like these days, the challenges. So I think I want to begin by saying that you may find this lecture to be a little schizophrenic. And what I mean by that is there are times when I will say things that make it sound like everything's great, that things couldn't be better, the glass is half full, we know what we're doing, and at other times I may sound much more negative. I think that's because the reality is like that. I think that parts of what we try to do in drug discovery we're in pretty good shape, and in other cases not. So you'll see that I kind of go back and forth. But I think what you'll realize is that you can't reduce any of these things to sound bites. There just aren't any easy answers. It's just a very complex process. So where I'd like to begin is giving you a little bit of a background in why I think drug discovery is hard. And I begin with this slide. Some of you may recognize this. This is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, Mount Katahdin up in Maine. Has anybody been to Mount Katahdin? Excellent. It's a very nice mountain to hike. And this particular stretch is about 0.3 of a mile long. It's about 2.5 feet wide. And on either side of you is an 800-foot drop. And on a good day, there are 40-mile-an-hour crosswinds. It's called the Knife Edge Trail. And I think it's a good metaphor because when you're doing drug discovery, you never feel stable. You never have enough information. You know that what you're doing is built on incomplete information, assumptions that maybe are incorrect, so you never have that feeling of stability. And things can go wrong very quickly. So that's why I think it's a good metaphor. What we do in drug discovery is we're trying to create important new medicines to treat human health, human disease. But we don't make very many new drugs, unfortunately, and a lot of the drugs we do make don't really transform the practice of medicine. They're more incremental. The process can take 15 or 20 years, and it can cost north of $1 billion, and most of the things in the clinic fail. So that's the reality. And so I think of another analogy, which comes from the aerospace field. So this is, of course, Chuck Yeager, first man who broke the sound barrier. And there's a great book called The Right Stuff. Has anybody read the book or seen the movie? Okay. Read the book? Okay, if you haven't read the book, if you've seen the movie but you haven't read the book, read the book. Well, I love Tom Wolfe. I think he's a great writer. And the book is fantastic. And he describes the lives of the test pilots back in the 1950s. Any mistake in judgment, any loss of nerve, any failure in the machinery could kill them. The death rate was 40%. And the saying that the test pilots had was, it can blow at any seam. So again, I think that's a decent metaphor. Now, I'm not saying that people who do drug discovery are as good looking as Tom Cruise, or as heroic as Chuck Yeager, but all analogies, as we know, are flawed, and you can only push them so far. But it really is true that when we're in drug discovery, it can blow at any seam. So it's actually very simple. There are really only 4 reasons for failure, and they're listed here. You can make the wrong molecule. You can have a good compound but not be able to deliver it to the body in the right concentrations or to the right places. You might pick the wrong target to go after. And so then you might make a great molecule, but it simply doesn't work because the target you've chosen to go after is not relevant for treating a disease. Or you might have picked a good target, but the wrong disease. This happens all the time, where the first clinical trial fails, but then you take the same molecule into a different clinical trial for a different disease, and it works the second time. So these are the 4 reasons for failure, and it really is as simple as that. But there are some overarching complications that make things even harder. And the first and far and away the most important is lack of information. And that'll come up a lot more in the lecture. And there's a few other things. You might think of them as more operational, but they're very important problems, and they're listed here. First of all, we're working on harder problems these days than we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. The hurdles are higher, and that's a good thing. We set a higher safety bar than we used to. The drugs have to be much cleaner than they were 20, 30 years ago. Plus, if we're working on a new medicine today, that drug has to be better than all the currently available medicines, right? So every year, as there are more drugs on the market, the standards get higher because there's a better panel of drugs against which you could treat the disease now. So a new drug has to be better than all of those. And then in addition, the very process of making a drug is so complex. It just takes very long, and it's hard to manage. And then there's the classic fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So if you work for a large drug company and you hear that your company is merging with another one, you kind of get paralyzed because you don't know if your project will survive, you don't know if you'll be laid off, and so that sort of thing tends to slow things down. So these last 2 points in particular, if you work in a large company or in a small company, you will experience these things differently. But they're both important in both large and small companies, and I'll have more to say about that later. So that, in a nutshell, this one slide explains, I think, really why this whole process is as hard as it is. So it's gotten to the point where everybody makes fun of us. And this is a particularly good caricature of an advertisement, a pharma advertisement. This is taken from The Onion. Some of you may not want to admit that you go to theonion.com once a week, like I do. Some of you may be willing to admit it. But this, of course, is a new drug from AstraZeneca called Sucrosa, which is nothing more than a 500 milligram sugar pill. It's basically a placebo. And as you can see in the upper right, it's occasionally effective against every imaginable disease. But in the lower right, it does come with a fairly long list of side effects. So this is actually a brilliant parody of the way pharmaceutical drugs are often marketed. So just to sum up, what have I said to you so far? We make very few new medicines because it can blow at any seam. The medicines we do make are usually not revolutionary. The process takes forever. It costs billions of dollars, and the failure rate is in the clinic, and everybody hates us. So that's the world that I inhabit. Okay. So you may want to have a little sympathy for me. So you might ask, well, why would somebody like me still do this, given everything I've just told you so far? So even though we're pariahs at cocktail parties, okay, so why do we do this? Well, I think the first thing is it's intellectually exhilarating because there's still so much yet to be learned, and it's very exciting. And I think that can't be overstated. I mean, it's both exciting and terrifying simultaneously. And so I think the quote from Hamlet really, captured it. This quote, and then a couple lines later, there's more on heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. I think that's exactly right. And so that's, in and of itself, I think, a phenomenal motivator. But even better than that, for me, is that even despite all of our limitations, once in a while, we are able to put a new medicine out into the world. And so this was from the approval of Vertex's cystic fibrosis drug nearly 2 years ago now. It's been a while. Now, this drug is not useful for everybody with cystic fibrosis, but there's a very well-defined, a genetically defined subset of patients who have a particular mutation to their CFTR gene, and those patients get tremendous benefit from Kalydeco. And so you can look out on the web and you can find blog entries, people who've taken the drug for a week, and they used to not even be able to climb a flight of stairs, and now they're out jogging, they're gaining weight, they feel better. So this is a drug that's actually transformational for that subset of the cystic fibrosis patients. So as I say, for me, that's a huge motivator. So that's why people like me stay in the game. And so clearly it's uplifting to be able to do this. And I think it's reminiscent of the Apollo moon missions. Some of you in the room are old enough, as I am, to remember that. Many of you are not. But think about it. What enabled us to get to the moon? These were huge, unsolved problems. Lots of different technical disciplines had to work together closely, learning from each other, helping each other. The science and the engineering, the technology was being invented as the process went on. It was emotional, it was risky, it engaged the human spirit, it mattered. It was important. So I think that, that's why people like me are going to stay in the game regardless, for these reasons. Okay, but at the same time, as I've said, our successes come only rarely. And so I think we still have to talk about our ignorance. We have to talk about the things we don't know and how that gets in the way and how we hopefully can change that. I think the Chinese proverb is fitting. In drug discovery, we're hunting in the dark, and it takes a long time, and the drug may not be there, just as the cat may not be there. And so we also have no unambiguous guidelines. We don't have a weather forecasting stone. And Lord knows I could use one. It would be great if we had that. But there's nothing as clear as this. And so that uncertainty, it applies both in the discovery of the new medicines, but also in the practice of medicine itself. for example, I think this phrase, flying blind, is exactly right. So think about it. When do we go to the doctor? We go to the doctor when we're sick. So, the horse is already out of the barn at that point. The doctor is reacting to the illness that we present in the office, right, in the doctor's office. And the doctor is myopic. There are very few tools, very few ways of measuring illness. And so often the doctor can't tell what's wrong with us. And so this quote, I think, from a very well-respected physician, Paul Yock, also a professor at Stanford, is absolutely correct. Doctors are making decisions based on woefully incomplete information. So that's the practice of medicine. So it's not just the discovery, but also the use of all of this technology in healthcare. And so then you can look at it from a different perspective. So this is a fellow named Roger Perlmutter, who's a big pharmaceutical executive. He's worked at several companies. He's a very smart guy, MD, PhD. And as he says here, the problem is that we just don't know enough about human physiology. We don't understand how the human-animal works. And he also goes on to say, and I think this is very important, and I'll come back to this later in the talk, we run a large clinical trial, often called a phase 3 study, thousands of patients. And then the drug gets approved. And then a year later, we find out that there was some problem with the drug after all. And people often say, well, gee, why is that? How could that be? The drug was approved. It was tested in thousands of patients. Well, the fact is, there are many side effects that only show up in 1 in 10,000 patients, or 1 in 100,000 patients. And so if you only run a 3,000 patient clinical trial, you simply don't see the problem. Again, because we don't have the right tools to look for the chance that there's a problem. We only know it when your liver fails, right? We don't know that there's a possibility that you might have a problem with your liver from taking this drug because our tools are not good enough. And so I think these quotes are important to keep in mind, and we'll talk about these things. So, the good drugs and the almost good drugs all look pretty similar, and so you don't really know whether you're going to get a tasty treat or an indigestible rubber bouncing ball, So by the time drugs get to phase 3, they all look phenomenal. They look like they will become medicines. But in fact, a lot of them still don't, because there are these subtle differences, and we don't have the right technology to tell the difference between the winners and the almost winners, And so that's why the quote on the previous slide from Roger Perlmutter is correct, is that simply testing the drug on a few thousand patients in a clinical trial doesn't give you all the information that you need. So here's a very specific example of our ignorance. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have taken chemistry, but even those of you who haven't, you'll have no trouble noticing that all 5 of these chemical structures are pretty similar. You see the core of these molecules are all the same, right? It's called a fluoroquinolone. There's a class of antibiotics. Who here has heard of or maybe taken Cipro? The Cipro, nobody takes Cipro anymore? That's weird. One in the back. Okay, that's weird. It's a very widely used drug. Guess you guys are all healthy. So Cipro and Floxin are 2 examples of drugs that are used pretty widely. The 3 on the bottom all made it onto the market, but then, because of those rare kinds of side effects that I mentioned, those 3 drugs were all pulled off the market within a few years of their approval. And the more pernicious problem even is that the nature of the problems are all different. So one drug has sort of an allergic reaction, one leads to a heart problem, a heart rhythm problem, and the one on the right leads to liver damage. So it's not just that they all had this rare toxicity which caused the 3 compounds on the bottom to be pulled off the market. That's bad enough, but even worse, the nature of the problem was different in all 3 cases. And so if in the year 1980 you had shown these 5 chemical structures to anybody and said, predict which are the ones that have the best chance of becoming drugs and which ones would not, based on all the available information, there would have been absolutely no way to tell the difference. So there are effective medicines that have come out of this effort. In aggregate, if you look at all the effort by all the drug companies at making fluoroquinolone antibiotics, the world has 2 useful drugs, the ones on the top. But you can see that this process is still very hit or miss, very risky. So really, everything I'm talking about can be boiled down to the single word, ignorance. And Stuart Firestein is a professor at Columbia, has written a book on the subject, given a great TED lecture. Those of you who aren't yet familiar with TED lectures, please go look them up. There's more than 1,000 of them. They're very interesting on all kinds of topics imaginable. So as he points out, ignorance does not equal stupidity. Okay? What I'm telling you is that people like me and everybody doing biomedical research, we're all ignorant. But that's a statement about the communal gap in our knowledge. We simply don't know enough yet. It's a very fundamental kind of problem. So we have to overcome that. So how are we going to overcome that is then the question. So I think first we have to acknowledge that the sorts of metaphors that we all use to describe what science is all about are just plain wrong. Science is not about gathering data. So, putting pieces of the puzzle together, peeling back the layers of the onion, etc. These are cute metaphors, but they're wrong because all of these imply that there's a finite amount of information. There's only so many puzzle pieces, right? Or there's only so many layers to the onion. You will eventually be done. And I think that a much more accurate way to look at it is the quote from Einstein here. The more we learn, the more the circumference of darkness grows as well. Every scrap of new insight leads to more questions. And so if it's not data gathering, I think a better metaphor is ripples in a pond. Whenever you disturb the pond, you create fresh ripples that push out in all directions, and then they interact with the other ripples from the other rock that you've thrown in the pond. And it seems very chaotic, hard to predict, hard to perceive in advance, but that's really much more accurate, I think, a more accurate description of what it's like to be doing science these days. The ripples all interact with each other, and they keep spreading outwards and get bigger and bigger. So that all you may take that as depressing, because, geez, it seems like we'll never end and the problems get harder and harder. But I think, on the other hand, we're getting smarter. And Ray Kurzweil reminds us that change is not a constant. If you haven't read about Ray Kurzweil, you probably want to look him up. Really interesting fellow. You don't have to believe everything he says. I don't, but he's interesting, and he's got a lot to think. He gives you a lot to think about. And he refers to the law of accelerating returns, the fact that knowledge is growing at an exponential rate. So I think that's a hopeful sign. Certainly, if I look back on my own career, I think about the way people like Ron and I did science when we were starting out in grad school versus the way science is done now. It really is a remarkably different thing. Tremendous advances in technology, basic understanding, and so forth. And I think if you take a long-term view, this becomes more clear. I think Bill Gates got it right. I mean, we tend to always get too excited about the change that will happen in the next year or two. And sometimes we're disappointed. Someone says, oh, we'll have, driverless cars by 2015. Well, probably we won't have driverless cars by 2015 on the road in mass. But by 2025 or 2035, we will. And we'll look back on that and we'll say, gosh, that was a pretty remarkable change. The future always ends up being weirder and more dramatically different than we could have imagined. So I think that's the right way to look at it. And another way to think about that is look at, again, the advances in aerospace. So from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to the maiden voyage of the Airbus A380. It's about 100 years, a century. But think about how many advancements had to take place during that century. So the use of wind tunnels and the use of computer simulations, material science, electronics, aeronautics, understanding of turbulence, and so forth and so on. There's no one event that you can point at over that 100 years and say, that was the moment when the Airbus A380 became possible. Rather, it was a series, almost an infinite number of incremental improvements, little things that add up to the enormous change that we see over the course of a century. So a lot of this depends on the lens through which you're looking at progress. If you're looking from one week to the next, you're often disappointed, or even 1 year to the next. But from decade to decade, or from century to century, it's a completely different picture. And many of you in the room today will be here in the year 2200. So you will be around for a very long time. Did I say 2200? 2100. Some of you, hey, if you can make it to 2200, even better. 2100. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I sometimes do that. So think about this Airbus A380. So they designed it on a computer, and they didn't build 19 of them that crashed. They built one, and they rolled it out of the hangar. This is in the spring of 2005. This was the maiden voyage of the Airbus A380. And it took off in a straight line, and it flew for a few miles, and it did a nice bank turn, and it came back around, and it landed, and it didn't crash. So think about how much had to be understood to be able to make that happen compared to just 100 years earlier. So now, the human body is more complex than designing an airplane. I readily grant you that. Again, this is an analogy. You can't push it too far. But we're also getting smarter at an accelerating rate. So how far will we be able to get over the coming century in our understanding of disease, of health, of the human body, of how to intervene and to prevent disease? How far do you think we'll get? Probably pretty far. So it's interesting, I think, to look at it from that perspective. So I think all of us can imagine that kind of a future, right? We can say, gee, it would be great if everybody lived to be 100 and was able to still go out and hike and, and garden and read the New York Times and so forth. So how do we do that? So I think this concept of P4 medicine is a good way to think about it. So Leroy Hood is a brilliant scientist who had a lot to do with the success of the Human Genome Project. He created a lot of the instruments that were used to collect all that genetic data. And he refers to P4 medicine. You can see what the four Ps are: predictive, preventative, personalized, participatory. So the idea is that we will be able to tell which one of us in the room is most likely to get a certain disease, right? We'll be able to do that. We'll know how to treat the disease before you have symptoms of the disease, because there'll be biomarkers that help us to know that you're in the very early stages of that disease or you're at risk of getting it, right? Personalized means that the way we treat one person is different from another. This is a common problem right now. This is, I think, particularly true in rheumatology, where rheumatologists will tell you that they know that when they look at their lupus patients, they know they're not exactly the same. There's something different. The underlying cause of the disease is probably not the same in all those patients. And the same thing is true for arthritis. It's probably true for all diseases. And so right now, you go into the doctor's office and they say, oh, you have rheumatoid arthritis, I'm going to give you methotrexate, or I'm going to give you Enbrel, or whatever drug. But in the future, there'll be 17 types of rheumatoid arthritis that have different underlying causes that can be treated in different ways. So personalized. Participatory is very important because all of us are going to be more responsible for our own health. We'll have to be taking care of ourselves better. Everybody in this room, I would think 20, 30 years from now, our insurance, the cost of the insurance we have will depend enormously on how we choose to live and whether we're proactive about dealing with the sorts of medical issues that we face. I think that's pretty much inevitable. So I've talked in the last few slides about science and how I think we're getting smarter and it's coming more quickly, and that's all good. But now let's talk a little bit more about culture, because that's part of this too. It's often overlooked. People think about just the scientific stuff, like what I've been saying. But the culture is actually more important than the science, believe it or not. The founder of Vertex, guy that I worked for more than 20 years, he said, success is, 98, 99% about people. And Thomas Kuhn pointed out that, the choice of which problems we all go after and the way we do that depends on culture. It depends on the way we frame the problems, how we think about it, the nature of the training we've had, the skills we have. All of those things determine the way we come at science. And so how does culture then do that? How does it determine? So let me tell you about what life is like in Cambridge, in the world that I've inhabited. It's a great place for biotech. So this fellow, who I know very well, Tom Hughes, I think he reminds us of the psychological difference between large and small companies. He was put on a committee to reduce bureaucracy at a large drug company. You have to let that sink in for a second. And that was the moment when he decided maybe it wasn't for him anymore, and he left to form a little tiny company called Zafgen that's working on drugs for obesity. That's a very typical kind of attitude, because people like Tom or people like me, we started our careers in big pharma, but we're impatient. You know, we want to get things done quickly. And then another quote, Deborah Dunshire was the CEO of Millennium, and she's an MD actually, not a PhD, and she says right here, you know, she wants to focus on coming up with drugs to treat people who don't have any good treatments. You know, that's her world. And what I'm saying about people like Tom and Deborah is not that they are outliers. They're exactly the opposite. This is a typical sort of attitude in Cambridge biotech. That's just how people in my world think. So we all know, of course, that Boston, you know, with all due respect to Worcester, Boston is the hub of the universe, you know, but this is not just a phenomenon found in Cambridge. Now, this slide is a bit wordy, but I've talked over the years with lots of scientists who've been successful and lots of teams that have been successful, and I've tried to understand what is it that enabled them to be successful. And on the left are individuals, and on the right are teams. And these are behaviors. This is not about the genetics that you're born with. This is about the way you choose to live. And the scientists who behave like that and the teams that behave like that are the ones that are far more likely to be successful. Now, you can find these kinds of behaviors anywhere. It's not just found in the little biotech companies in Cambridge. There are people like this at, you know, the biggest drug company in the world, Pfizer. There are great people and there are great teams there too. So it's not as black and white as, oh, you know, you don't find these kinds of behaviors in big companies. That would be far too simplistic. But I think what you can ask is, what is it about the cultures in a small or in a large company that either enable or tend to impede these kinds of behaviors? How do we support or detract from that? And I think, and again, a bit too wordy of a slide, but there was a fellow named Paul Janssen who ran, not surprisingly, Janssen Pharmaceuticals in Belgium 50, 60 years ago. The most prolific drug hunter in history. More than 60 drugs came out of his labs over a period of a few decades. And he knew way back when, because these are all, you can see at the bottom, the references, he had said all through his career exactly what his magic formula was, the way he would try to treat his people, the sorts of attitudes that he would instill in his teams. So very consistent with what I had on the previous slide. So it all kind of fits together. It makes sense that we know what kinds of behaviors we need to go for. And so anytime I walk in the door at an organization and they want me to try to help them out, I'm not actually starting out by asking about their science. I'm starting out by looking for these kinds of things. Because no matter how smart the scientists are, they may not have the chance to really do something exciting and valuable if they don't live in an organization that supports this kind of behavior. And one very specific thing I wanted to bring up is the great teams that I've seen and been blessed to be a part of, they always have a sense of being part of something bigger than themselves. Sometimes this is referred to as cathedral thinking. So you think about being a laborer working on, you know, Notre Dame or Reims. Okay, think about that. Okay, it's going to take a century. Again, we come back to centuries. It take a century to build that cathedral. And so it's bigger than you are. There's a sense of wonder and awe. You have to be resilient because sometimes the building collapses. I don't know how much of this you've read, but it's very interesting. I mean, again, the mindset there, because oftentimes as these cathedrals were going up, because they were really pushing on the boundaries, they didn't have, you know, CAD/CAM software to tell them if, you know, the weight distribution was right or if the beams were strong enough. Sometimes the building would be halfway up and the whole thing would just collapse after 40 years, and they would start over. They would keep going. So that sense of resiliency. So again, these are metaphors, these are analogies. They may not be completely applicable, but I think that there's a lot to this. And I see this over and over again. And I think that the small companies have an advantage because in a small company, you can see the big picture more easily because you're, I guess the phrase is you're a bigger fish in a little pond. You see how your work connects with all of the other work going on. You can see how your part of the story fits into the bigger narrative. And I think that ends up making it a little bit easy because your individual contribution matters. And this is highly motivational, I think, for many people. So let's dig in a little bit more to this distinction between big and small companies. So there are a number of trade-offs. So I think, again, there's excellent people everywhere, so it's not about IQ points or anything silly like that. But the large companies have time at their side if they want to use it. They have greater resources. They have deeper knowledge. Those are all real advantages for the big companies. The smaller companies, on the other hand, are not as complex. And complexity is deadly because it obviously makes it much harder to make decisions. So the small companies are much more nimble, and they're better at risk-taking. And they're forced to look outside their walls. In large companies, sometimes the scientists get a little complacent because, in fact, literally just last week, I was working with a large company, and I heard someone say, well, we don't need any help in this area because we've got all the world's experts in this field. And that's wrong because Bill Joy, everybody's heard of Moore's law about, the number of transistors doubling every 18 months. Joy's law, Bill Joy was the guy who founded Sun Microsystems. Joy's law is no matter how smart your people are, most of the smart people work for somebody else. And that's true even in a very large organization. And so the small companies recognize that they need to be connected. They know that they don't have all the smart people. And so there's never any ambiguity about that. And that enables them to be much more aggressive about going outside their walls for help. And then the last two, I think, although they may seem a little squishy, I think they're actually very important. There's quite, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the cathedral thinking, there's a sense of engagement, of being part of something bigger. And that turns out to be exciting, and that leads to kind of a happiness. I'm glad I'm coming into work in the morning kind of a feeling, which actually is much more prevalent, I think, in the small companies. Now, what's interesting, I think, is as we come back to this concept of accelerating change, because that's true, for companies to be successful, or for any organization to be successful, you have to be able to change and to have everybody involved to be deeply engaged. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now in the big companies. So there's actually a fellow that used to work at Vertex. I know him reasonably well, and he wrote a book a few years ago. His name is Mike Wokash. He wrote a book called Pharmaplasia. Plasia, of course, is just a growth, right? A neoplasia is just like a little tumor. So pharmaplasia basically is when there's rapid growth, uncontrolled growth in a company. At some point, you just can't manage the company anymore. It makes it hard to make the right decisions. And then things start going wrong. It's very unpredictable. Bad stuff starts to happen. And so the big companies, yes, they have the strengths I mentioned before, the resources, but Darwin said it very well. You have to be responsive to change. And that's, I think, a very hard thing to do. And it's that lack of nimbleness that I think is troubling in the large companies. Now, this fellow, I only recently came across him, which is embarrassing because he's been active for many, many years. He's a social entrepreneur. His name is Bill Drayton. Very interesting guy from what I've read about him in the last couple weeks, and I'm going to learn more about him soon. He basically talks about this in great detail, this idea of what he calls cognitive empathy. Some people refer to this as emotional intelligence. There are different words for it. But basically, we're making things up as we go, just like the Apollo moon missions. Because it's not like 100 years ago where there were rules, and you could follow the rules, and you'd be making the right decisions. In a time of change, the rules only get you so far. And then beyond that, you have to make things up. You have to be nimble and change what you do, right? So this may not be a new insight, but I think what he's really saying is we have to accept that that's happening to a greater and greater degree. So for all of you, as you think about your lives and you think about your career, I think this concept of constantly reinventing yourself and learning and changing what you do and getting better and better, I think that's a necessary component, regardless of what field you get into. This is not, of course, this is not limited to science. This is not a commentary about science per se. This fellow is not thinking just about the science area. Okay, so I'd like to, in the last section, I'd like to just dispel some myths about drug discovery, because these come up a lot. It's a big topic. Could talk for hours about this. I think we have to acknowledge, as I said in the onion caricature slide, a lot of people really just don't like what the pharmaceutical industry is doing. And there's a lot of people who would say that nothing that pharma does can be trusted. Prices are artificially high, that we're holding back on cures. There's a lot of conspiracy theories. And the poster child for this sort of thing is a fellow named Kevin Trudeau. Has anybody here heard of Kevin Trudeau? Okay, so he's pretty well known. Basically, he's provided completely fake medical advice. He just makes stuff up, and he writes these books, and he's probably responsible, or could well be responsible, for thousands of deaths, but we'll never know. There's no way to measure the impact of what he's done. What we do know is he's a convicted felon. He's convicted on multiple fraud counts. He's currently in jail. He has no medical training, and he's provided absolutely no scientific support for any of the claims that he's ever made to back up his miracle cures. Those are all facts. And despite that, he has convinced millions of gullible people, and that includes desperate patients. And if any of you have ever been in that situation or know somebody who has, somebody who's very sick can, be really driven by emotion. They're desperate. They want a cure. And basically, he's convinced those people that the Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Trade Commission and people like me are all in cahoots. We're hiding the truth, that we know how to cure cancer, but we don't want people to get better. We'd rather that people be sick because we can make more money that way. That's actually his point of view. And the quote at the top of the slide, in case you're wondering, the quote makes absolutely no sense at all on any level. It's just completely nonsensical. And the quote's here from Michael Shermer, who's a well-known sort of skeptic debunker. You can see them here. You basically have to go to this guy's website to get the cures, and then you find you have to pay on the website for the cures that the drug companies don't want to give you, and so forth and so on. And if you have the stomach for it, you can go to salon.com and type in what Kevin Trudeau doesn't want you to know, and you can get a lot more information. So what do I mean by conspiratorial thinking? So let's go through just a very simple example. So what do you see in this pattern of numbers? Call it out. Do you notice anything? Come on. Is there something that sort of jumps right out at you? What's that? Okay. Do you see long strings? Do you see those? So what does that make you think? Right. You think there's a pattern. So do you think this is real data or fake data?
But I'm supposed to think it's fake.
But you've done this test before?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So that's a good point. A lot of people, when they see something like this, they say, oh, 8 heads in a row. If I flipped a coin 8 times in a row, 2 to the 8th is 256. There's no way that it's going to come up heads 8 times in a row, right? But of course, you're not flipping a coin 8 times. You're flipping 100 coins, right? So you're doing those 8 coin flips 100 times. And it could be all heads or all tails. And so in fact, there's about a 50-50 chance that entirely by random chance, you would get 8 heads or 8 tails in a row in 100 coin flips. So this, in fact, is not fake data. It's real data. So the way you know that a series of coin flips is fake is if you never see more than like 3 in a row. Because if you're making up fake data and you start going heads, 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 you think, oh, that'll look suspicious, and you don't do it. But in fact, it's this that shows you that it's real data. So the point is that we see patterns all the time. All of us. I do this, everybody does this. So that's one example of how we can make mistakes. And again, back to Michael Shermer, this is a great little article he wrote in Scientific American about 4 years ago. There's a number of kind of errors in thinking that all of us are making, including myself. We all do this. And so we tend to see patterns where there aren't any. We think things are teaching us something that's not really there. We tend to believe the world is controlled by other people. So they, the Kevin Trudeau bit, they don't want you to know that there's a cure for cancer, and they are hiding it from you. So that's a good example of agenticity. And then oftentimes we only want to believe what we already believe, and so we only see the things that confirm what we already knew. And then, of course, after the fact, we can always explain everything. And so these are just examples. Bright light being a great antiseptic, as they say, I'm going to talk about a few examples that are relevant for the pharmaceutical industry. So the first is, people say, well, why do clinical trials take so long? What's going on? There must be something behind it, something nefarious. Well, the fact is, we're doing a much better job these days of being really careful, of insisting that there's a lot of data that needs to be generated and carefully analyzed before we let drugs onto the market. And as I said before, we still don't get it right all the time, but we're collecting much more data. You can see just over a period of about half a decade, big percentage changes in how much data had to be collected just to run clinical trials. And we have a quote from the guy who at the time was running the Food and Drug Administration, or, well, I should say the part of the FDA that was responsible for approving new medicines. And he basically says right here, we're raising the standards. So that's good. So the reason it takes longer is because the trials are larger, harder, and more complex, not because of something more nefarious. Now, another one that comes up all the time is drug prices. Now, I'm just as disgusted as anybody else by how expensive drugs are. I've already explained to you why drugs are expensive. It's because we're ignorant. It's because we fail most of the time. But it gets worse than that, because sometimes drug companies charge too much for products that don't provide a lot of value. And that's crazy, because there should be some accountability. It should be the case that a drug is priced in some sense commensurate with the value that it provides. But the fact is that profit is not the explanation. So the pharmaceutical companies have about a 20% profit margin. Now, that's very high compared to most industries. So there's no question that the drug companies make a lot of money. But if you passed a law, think about this as a thought experiment. If you passed a law and said, no profit, no drug company can make a penny of profit, drug prices would drop by 20%, because that's the profit margin. And so if we're complaining about a drug that costs $100,000, I think we'd still be complaining if the drug cost $80,000, if you completely eliminated the profit. So the issue is not profit, although we have to talk about profit, and we have to be careful to make sure that the prices of drugs are fair and reasonable. But my point, and occasionally drug companies get too greedy and we have to whack them for that. So I agree with all of that. But my point is that that's nibbling around the edges. The fundamental problem is ignorance. That's the thing that's really the enemy. To get from the Wright brothers to the Airbus A380 requires knowledge. And that's the thing that I think will make drug prices come down. So another thing that I think you hear quite a lot is that the drugs are invented by say the National Institutes of Health or by academics. And that then all the drug companies do is they grab those inventions and then they sort of clean them up a little bit and they market them. I know I have academic positions. Some of my best friends are academics. I love and I work with academia all the time, but I think what this slide says, this comes from Kevin Kelly's interesting book, What Technology Wants, which I recommend reading, although again, you won't necessarily believe everything that's in it. The ideas are cheap. So thousands and thousands of people thought, gee, maybe we could use electricity for lighting. And then some of them eventually got down to the point of thinking about a light bulb, and a few of them even made prototypes, but it was really only Edison and the people who worked with him, like Thomas Insull, who was kind of his business genius, the two of them working together with a team of very smart people, they're the ones who produced the whole system that enabled lighting, right? And so the original idea is important, but it's only a part of the problem, or a part of the solution, I should say. And so a similar analogy is oftentimes when I'm going out and about, I meet people who say, I invented a drug. And personally, I never say that, because if you think about what a drug is, you think about how horribly complex it is. 1,000 people contribute to the creation of that new medicine. There's no one individual who is responsible for the drug. And so you have to think about drug discovery kind of like this. It's a team, it's a large number of people, and so there is a huge, valuable, important contribution that often comes from an academic lab. So we honor that, we should reward it, we need to encourage that. That's all good. But it's a mistake to say that the drug came from the academic lab and that all the rest was kind of trivial. That would be like saying that the idea for lighting, was found at the top and then all Edison did, is turn it into an actual working productive system, because that's not the reality of invention. That's not how anything is produced. So another myth is related to the genome. So, the human genome has been solved. That happened a decade ago or more. And so there's a lot of fun cartoons like this talking about how great it is. There's a lot of hype in pharma about everything, but I think the poster child is genomics. I particularly like this cartoon. I like the dorky guy on the right who says, I think I found a corner piece, trying to solve the 3 billion puzzle pieces of the human genome. I think if you cut through all that hype, a reasonable perspective comes from Eric Lander. Eric Lander said that all we have with the human genome is a parts list. That doesn't mean we know what the parts do or how to assemble them or what makes the plane fly. And understanding all of that, understanding the system, is the work of the coming century, not decade. He said century. Now, I think that we're learning a lot already from the genome. It's already adding value. But the idea that, now we have the genome and drugs will just flow like water, that unfortunately, I wish it were true, but unfortunately that's not the reality. It's going to take a lot longer for that to happen. So another thing you hear all the time is that drug companies like Me Too drugs that are providing incremental benefit. I've never worked on such a program in my whole career. But I think this quote from the president, or the CEO rather, of Celgene, and he and I were both at a meeting in New York last week, and he said this at the meeting, you have to be thinking disruptively. You can't go after incremental change. It just doesn't make any sense. I think healthcare budgets are under pressure, so any new medicine, if it only provides an incremental benefit, it's just unlikely to be used. It doesn't help anybody medically or economically. So that's not what the drug companies are trying to do. There's really very little of that goes on these days. And I think there's objective data supporting that. This is a paper that just came out in Nature Reviews a few months ago, and somebody did a very thorough analysis of everything that was publicly available about what drug companies work on. And it's a little bit of a complicated slide, but the bottom line is roughly 3/4 of the projects being worked on in pharma, based on all the information that we have available, publicly available, are novel targets. What that means is targets for which there's never been any clinical proof that they'll work. So 3/4 of the effort is aimed at things that are really kind of, rolling dice. We hope that they will provide medical benefit, but we don't know. And even on those projects, those novel projects, you can see that a lot of the time there are multiple companies working on them. So when someone says, Me Too drugs are bad, I have to think about what's the reality. The reality is that right now, there's some project, let's call it Project X, some target X, and there may be 5, 6 drug companies all working on that at the same time. And it's a novel target because right now there's no evidence that a drug for that target will provide any medical benefit for arthritis or what have you. Maybe 3 or 4 of those companies will succeed, and maybe this target is a good one. Most of the time it's not, but let's just in this example say that it is. 10 years from now, there'll be 4 drugs on the market. They'll probably be chemically kind of similar to each other. One will be a little better than the others. And people will point at those and say, look, there you go again, the pharmaceutical industry doing Me Too science. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is right now, all those companies are working on a novel target without knowing whether any of their efforts are going to produce medicines. So in most cases, of course, they all fail. It's all wasted effort. But once in a while, you pick a target that is good, and you get multiple drugs because all these companies are working on them at the same time without completely knowing what each other are doing, because we're not all sharing information quite as much as we might wish everybody did. And so we're all working in the dark, in a sense, about the competition. And so that's why you often get these scenarios where all of a sudden there's 3, 4 drugs all coming onto the market near each other in time, because people are working on those targets at the same time. So that's the reality of novel versus me too. So I've covered it a lot in this last section, so let me just summarize what I've said so far in this section, and then I'll go to my wrap-up. So clinical trials are slow because we're being careful, right? We're collecting lots of data on thousands of patients. Even if we banned all profit, drugs would still be expensive. They might drop by 20%, and that might help us in the short term, but in the long run, the problem is ignorance. That's what we have to deal with. And the third point, there's no question that from academia and NIH and other government labs, there are tremendous contributions, but we have to understand what that contribution is in the larger picture. It's very valuable, but it isn't the whole story. All of us love new technologies like the human genome, and they do add value in the long run, but not as quickly as we'd like. They don't instantly lead to better outcomes, and pharma really doesn't care anymore, if it ever did, but certainly doesn't care now about Me Too, because there's no point in doing that. So these are all examples of myths that you hear all the time, and there's lots of things we do badly, but I think these are examples of points of view that really are just not accurate reflections of what we do. So I've tried to give you a feeling for how I see the world, and sadly, I have not, after 27 years of effort, I have not created a miracle pill that cures everything. But I think I've learned a few things that I think might be helpful. I think we're bad at making drugs because we're ignorant, and because it's a very complex process. I think culture matters greatly, and that's true no matter where you are, big companies or small companies. But there are undoubtedly these differences that I talked about, a few of them, between the large and the small companies. And so the challenges in each type of organization can be very, very different. And they're each contributing, I think, different things to the overall process of trying to discover new medicines. So I think with these 3 points, I think there's some clear implications, if you will. I think the most obvious one is that we need to keep supporting basic research, as well as education in general. We want to make sure that the brightest students, many of you in the room here, consider going into some sort of biomedical career. Is very, very important. I can't think of anything more important than that, really. The second, I think, implication is because of these cultural issues, we have to encourage certain behaviors. We have to encourage risk-taking and resilience, because things do go wrong so often. We have to encourage teamwork, and the fellow I told you about, Bill Drayton, talks about change agents, people who can adapt to the ever evolving situations that we find ourselves in, people who can adapt to that explosive, exponential kind of growth. And then finally, I think we have to realize that it is a constantly evolving ecosystem. And that means that there are all kinds of new business models being tackled all the time. There are for-profits, there are non-profits, there's government activity. It all sort of smushes together. All of this is a good thing, but it means that a lot of the assumptions that we carry around in our heads are wrong, because we're imagining the model of what the industry was like 15, 20 years ago, and not the way it is now or the way it will evolve to be 10 years from now. And so we need to really think about the sorts of behaviors that we want. We want NIH working with industry. We want industry sharing their data more readily. There's all kinds of changes. And so we have to think about that whole ecosystem and the behaviors that we need to encourage so that we can get the best possible results, better results than what we've gotten up till now. So I hope I've given you some things to think about. Happy to take questions now or answer them later. I'm easy to reach at that email address. And again, my thanks to Ron and to Holy Cross for the invitation to come and speak, and thanks for your attention.
Questions, Mark?
Please.
What initiatives are being done in the pharma industry to encourage the sharing of data? I know in academia, in academic research, a lot of it's being driven by the government, by the
Right.
NSF, the NIH,
Right.
requiring people to make their data open. But what is being
Right.
done?
So if you couldn't hear it, the question was, what is being done in pharma to encourage the sharing of data? And in fact, not as much as should be, but a lot of this actually is coming through the FDA. So the FDA now is being much more rigorous about, for example, all the details of clinical trials being made public. There's a website, clinicaltrials.gov, for example, which lists all the clinical trials that are enrolling patients. And information about the results of those clinical trials are now becoming public to a much greater degree. Probably not as quickly as we would like, but compared to 5 years ago, there's a much greater willingness to share or acceptance of the fact that they have to. Maybe willingness is the wrong word, but you are starting to see much more of that. I think that's very, very important. And then the other thing is, I think I think the drug companies realize that to keep the best people, they have to be willing to let more of the basic research that they do out the door. And so I think the publication rates of the interesting stuff, I think you're seeing more of that than used to be true, which I think encourages more basic discovery to come out of pharma if the scientists doing the work know that they'll also get to publish it. So I think those are two things that help.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that medicine is becoming more personalized and preventative.
Yeah.
How do you see the role of cell-based therapies in the future, like regenerative medicine or tissue engineering?
Yeah, I have a whole slide deck on that. That's great. Great topic. Yeah, I think that there are already areas where regenerative medicine is useful. I think the trick there is a lot of it really is an engineering problem. In other words, a lot of times the issue is, can you create the tissues? Can you create them in a consistent, reproducible way, deliver them to the body in the right way to see effects? And so first generation cell therapy, people would take a heart patient and they would basically inject some cardiomyocytes directly into the heart of the patient, and that doesn't really work because the cells don't stay there. Actually, so then you ask, okay, maybe there's a way to deliver the cells via some kind of a patch, that will cause the cells to stay and actually take root and provide the benefit. So things like that. It's really an engineering problem. So I think what we're going to find is that it will be gradual because these engineering challenges are so complex. And some organ systems are more straightforward. That's the wrong word, but they're a little easier than others. So for example, there are artificial trachea now. So people who have Barrett's esophagus, which is an inflammatory condition in the esophagus, it can lead to esophageal cancer, which is nasty. But there actually now are people who've had their tracheas replaced because people have grown artificial tracheas. Shouldn't say artificial, they're human tissue, replacement tracheas, and basically done the surgery. And the same things have been done with bladders. So certain tissue systems, certain organ systems are a little more approachable, maybe not straightforward, right? And so those things are coming, but what we're going to find is that each of them is unique. It has unique challenges, and it requires engineering. And so some of the most important advances in medicine in the next couple of decades will come because of engineers who are getting more involved in biomedical research and bringing that whole way of thinking to the problem. Yeah, it's hugely interesting and important topic. Yeah.
How do you choose what diseases that you're going to design a drug for? Is it like by the amount of people that are going to benefit from it, or like the economics of it, or the culture surrounding a certain disease?
Right. So every drug company has everybody has a different way of thinking about that. We talked about this actually this morning in a class. My own answer is, as long as there's at least 1,000 patients in the world who have that disease, that's plenty for my tastes. And I say that just because at some point I know I'm going to need to go back to some guy with money. And if I say to him, there's only 19 patients in the whole world with the disease, give me $50 million to run the clinical trials, he's going to laugh at me. So as long as you've got at least 1,000 patients, I think that's sort of a practical number. So beyond that, it becomes a question of where do you think you have a shot at doing something medically useful? Do you understand the disease? Can you identify the patients? Do you have a way of determining if you've done something useful? Some clinical trials might take 10 years not practical. Some clinical trials, you can get a readout in a few weeks. So a lot of it is really that kind of very pragmatic set of questions, because you'd love to be able to cure every disease, but do you know enough? Do you have enough information? Can you run the clinical trial? You see? So it's those, for me, those are the very pragmatic questions that I ask. So there are drug companies now getting into areas or getting out of areas because they're saying, we don't know enough, or we do know enough. So they're making conscious, deliberate choices based on the knowledge they have. And that kind of makes sense in a way. It's always sad when you read that article that says, like just last week, BMS announced it's getting out of neuro research. And I know the guys in Wallingford, Connecticut, who work on neuro at BMS. They're really smart. They're really good scientists. But BMS has made a decision. They've said, look, we don't know enough about those diseases. And so the science we're doing is bad science. So we could keep going, but the chances of us producing medicines that help anybody, the chances are low. And so that's a deliberate choice to try to pick your bets, you know, to work in an area where you think you have a decent chance of doing something that's, you know, medically important. Yeah. Other questions?
Mark, how do you see the generic drug market impacting this, and particularly into the future, would you get less ignorant about our drug design?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the best things about medicine is the fact that, you know, patents don't last forever. And so even if a drug is expensive, after, you know, maybe 10 years of being on the market, it becomes a generic. And the price in the United States drops typically by, what, 80% or so. So some of them are still expensive, but far, far less expensive. And so every time I take that long view, that decade-long view, you know, I think it's important to think about the role of generics. And that's important because we know that price really has a huge impact on who gets medicine. It's some of you, again, this came up this morning in the class. I apologize to those of you who've heard me say this 6 hours ago, but a lot of people who have, you know, very basic treatable diseases just don't get medical care. People with high blood pressure don't take medicine. People with high cholesterol. So stuff that's entirely treatable that would dramatically lower their risk, they don't. And so generics actually are really useful in that regard because the copays get smaller. And if the copays get smaller, more people are likely to actually go pick up their prescription at CVS. It's kind of weird. I think all of us, you know, in the room, we live in kind of a privileged world where we probably, you know, most of us have had enough income and enough health care that we don't necessarily worry about that $10 copay. But unfortunately, a lot of people do. So the cheaper drugs get, in the long run, the better. Yeah. And that's going to be just as true for the biologics, you know, the injectable drugs that are now so popular. And that'll be true for them as well. They're hard to manufacture right now. But as our knowledge gets better, we'll get better at making the injectable drugs generic. Right now, that's a difficult thing to do. Oral little pills, you know, oral medicines are pretty easy to turn into generics. The injectable protein drugs and the antibodies and such are harder right now. But that technology is advancing too, so it'll get easier to make generic injectable drugs. Yeah, very important topic. Yeah.
One more question?
Yeah.
So do pharmaceutical companies also have basic science research going on, or is it primarily like actually drug development? Like where does most basic science?
Yeah, it happens in a lot of different places. I think drug companies do basic research. A lot of that does happen in academia or at NIH. Okay, so NIH is a $40 billion government agency. There's thousands of researchers actually who work for the government in NIH. And then the NIH also writes grants to thousands and thousands of professors in the US who then do basic research. So that's a big part of it. But drug companies also do basic research as well. More in some companies and less in others. You know, there's kind of a range of tolerance for that. A lot of it has to do with the leadership. So I'll give you an example. I think Novartis, which is based, well, they're in Basel, Switzerland, but they're also in Cambridge. The guy who runs that is a guy named Mark Fishman, who used to be a professor at Mass General, really good basic researcher, MD, PhD, and so he, as an example, really strongly encourages basic research within the Novartis culture. So again, it comes back to culture. Every organization is a little different. So Novartis is an example of a company that does a lot of that. There are other drug companies that don't do quite so much of that. Merck used to do a lot. They do less now. So again, over time, these things can evolve. But it happens in a lot of different places. And increasingly, it's happening outside of the US, which again is a good thing. You know, it's not just, you know, that the only, you know, it's not just that, you know, innovation happens in the US. It's happening all around the world, which in the long run is good.
If there are additional questions, I invite you to come up and ask Mark personally, but